Data visualization is just a form of storytelling. It involves numerous editorial choices, such as what variables to display, what data to filter out, what title to include, what graph type to choose. All sorts of decisions are made in the data visualization process. I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to share with you some student work. And as you're looking at this student work, I want you to be thinking about what story this student was trying to tell with their data. And in that process, what choices did they make that worked well? And what choices did they make that didn't really work out for them? So why don't you pause the video for about 20 seconds and take a look at this graph, and then when you're ready, turn it back on. So let me tell you a little bit about what I see when I look at this graph. I notice a few things. First of all, their title up here is super descriptive, very helpful and informative. From it, I can tell that the student is trying to tell a story about how these different filter types are related to the arsenic levels in the water, presumably to figure out if those filter types are effective. I also really appreciate that they have a key over here that easily breaks down those 4 different filter types and assigns colors to them to make the visualization more appealing. And finally, I noticed that they have dragged arsenic, micrograms per liter, over here to the x-axis, and that their font is of a reasonable size that makes it easily read. However, because they've chosen a pie chart, the arsenic levels that they're trying to communicate about are not being communicated. Instead, the graph is really just telling us what is the proportion of the water samples that were taken from places with each of these different filtration systems, which isn't what they were going for based on the title. And this type of error is actually really, really common. It's one of the trickiest skills for novice graphers to master, choosing the correct graph type. Tuva has a graph choice chart that is intended to help students with that can be found under the teaching dropdown when you click on data literacy resources, and then when you click on create graphs. There's an elementary one and a secondary school one. But that's not what we're going to focus on today. What I want to show you today is actually a Tuva lesson that's designed to promote graph choice skills and metacognition. And this lesson is called What Can and Can't You Say About Boiling Water? It can be found in the Tuva content library for science. So let's take a look at it a little bit closer. Each of the steps in this short lesson ask students to look at a pre-made graph and decide what information can they learn from that graph and what information can they not learn from that graph. And then they're asked to explain in general terms what that graph type is good at doing or communicating. So let's take a look at step 1 as an example. It asks students to look at this pie chart over here on the left and decide if it can tell us what temperature the water was when it was boiled. The answer is no. There's no temperature information on here. And then it also asks if it can tell us what proportion of time the water spent in each of the observation states. The answer to that question is yes. And then at the bottom, it asks students to explain to another student what a pie chart can tell you and provides some language support for students if they need it. Each of the steps, in fact, follows a similar flow. Step 2 has students look at a line graph and do similar tasks. And then finally, step 3 has students look at a line graph with a key and has them answer some simple questions. This data story would be a really great way to start a class. It's quick, it can be completed in about 15 minutes, and then you could follow it up by having students create their own graphs using data that you've collected in prior class periods. Or you could use it as an intervention. So let's say you noticed that your students hadn't been picking the correct graph types. You wanted to use a little metacognition to help them think about graph types when they're looking at them as a communication tool. And then you could say, all right, now everybody, let's pull out the graphs you created last class and let's critique and revise our own graphs using a similar thinking process. Having students engage in this sort of metacognition with graphs made by other people is going to help them to slow down and think about the choices they're making when they're using data visualizations to tell a story. So thank you so much for listening, and keep an eye on Tuva's YouTube channel for more quick tips and tricks to help boost your students' data literacy.